Good morning and welcome to this EU side event for COP27 hosted by Environmental Defence Fund here in Europe. I'm delighted to have a really exciting panel to discuss a very topical issue this morning. We have 4 in the room and 1 on Zoom, but we're going to start off with some opening remarks from Hannah Ryder, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Development Reimagined. Hannah.
Thank you very much, Jill, and it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to the European Union for bringing together and Environmental Defence Fund for bringing together this excellent panel. In my firm, Development Reimagined, we are an international development consultancy focused on, with a mission for sustainable development and poverty reduction. We closely analyse climate action within African countries and the importance of developing strategic partnerships with the rest of the world to ensure more climate resilient economies across the global south. We recently released a report entitled Bolstering Africa's Strategic Climate Change Engagement with China. And what I want to do today is open this discussion and provide a few scene-setting remarks so that which are in line with much of the analysis that we did in that report and through other aspects. Now, I want to set the scene based on what we have also seen when we do speak to banks and work with banks across the world, and especially those working in the African region. And there are a number of narratives that we believe generally need to be dismantled in order for action to be strengthened in the banking sector in order to bank on the future. And today I'd like to highlight 3 in particular. The first narrative is that African and emerging economies are behind. And if you have a look at the first slide that we show here, this narrative is not a real narrative. In fact, African countries are very ambitious. 53 African countries, 99% of African countries have submitted their nationally determined contributions to the UNFCCC. This highlights the strong commitment of African countries to climate action. Within those NDCs, the vast majority, and again, close to 99% of the NDCs refer to renewables targets. And in addition, there are 25% of African countries which have committed to net zero goals as well. Indeed, 14 of the countries have committed to greenhouse gas emissions of over 45%. And a further 13 aim for over 30% emissions, which means that in total, over half of African countries aim for 30 or more reductions on business as usual. I won't go into the amount of renewables expected through all of this, but you'll find that in our report. But just to put this in context, the EU ambition is a 55% reduction by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. And China's ambition is a 65% carbon intensity reduction by 2030 versus 2005 levels. So these are significant commitments and show that the narrative of a lack of ambition is not there and it is not true. Second, the second narrative that needs to be dismantled is that African countries and emerging markets are risky. And while, of course, there is some truth to that, a lot of that is about perceptions. Much of it is with regards to there are problems of asymmetric information, what I've called the market for lemons, if you follow any of the op-eds that I tend to write. And what the perception of high risk in African and emerging markets leads to are the kinds of results that we see, for instance, of the fact that only 2% of renewable production is on the African continent, yet, on the other hand, there are projections that Africa could supply 40% of the world's solar energy and more than 10% of wind capacity by 2050. And that mismatch is driven very much through ideas around risk. It also drives differentiated interest rates. Mia Motley was talking about that in her opening speech yesterday at COP27. And of course, it drives the fact that only 3% of public and private climate finance goes to the African continent. This is often seen as kind of something that Africans need to work on, but I suggest it's actually something which banks as well can do much more on, and I'll just come to that very shortly after I mention the third narrative, which I believe needs to be dismantled. The third narrative is that action in African markets and emerging markets needs to be focused on small-scale, decentralized approaches. And I think this is also a problematic narrative which needs to be dismantled. And the last slide, I think we have it, which shows some scenarios which we've worked on. No need if we can't have it. The African Development Bank has estimated that African countries need between 1.3 and 1.6 trillion US dollars to implement climate commitments and NDCs. And while that's based on the understanding that there will be significant growth on the continent, and that is important. The growth is not just about growth in access to energy, for example, growth to ensure that households get access to energy, for example, through solar panels and so on. It's also about growth for industry and manufacturing. The African continent is aiming to be the world's largest manufacturing hub in the world by 2063. And of course, that makes sense for the world. The African continent has got the largest labor population and will be a source for manufacturing. So how do we provide that industrial growth? We can only do that through large-scale green energy, large-scale green logistics. And so there needs to be not just an emphasis on extra capacity, but it's not just a question of going green, it's a question of green growth across the continent with regards to strengthening partnerships. So with that, what does it mean for today's discussion? I hope that as we take this discussion forward, we will be asking how can banks join in dismantling these narratives? How can banks change their ways of working and risk profile modeling scenarios like that we just showed today? And just to give you a sort of final example, if in 1957, China's emissions were accounted for about the same amount as the African continent does today globally. If we were going back in time to 1957, what would we say to the bankers at that point about what they should be doing and what would they be doing? Let's have that kind of scenario and thought in as we go ahead in this discussion. What would we do differently? What can we do differently? And therefore, how do we look to the future? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for setting the scene for what I hope is going to be an interesting and lively conversation. Let me briefly introduce our panel. So in the room here, we have Ginny Yan, who is the Chief China Economist at the Industrial Commercial Bank of China and Standard. We have Anjali Pandit, who is the Managing Director and Head of Sustainable Bonds for Europe, Middle East, Africa and Americas for HSBC. On the line in Sharm-el-Sheikh this morning is Abhishek Bhaskar, who leads Accelerating the Coal Transition Investment Programme for the Climate Investment Funds. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give some opening remarks focusing on what their organisation is doing and how they're thinking about the investment in developing countries, the criteria that they have, or who they advise on this as well. So for some, they're in an advisory role, and explain a little bit about their role in their institution. So Ginny, can I start with you, please?
Thank you very much, Jill, and fantastic to be part of this very interesting panel. And I think it's very timely because we talk a lot about climate change, but really with industrialized nations at the forefront of driving action and investment. And of course, financial sector is very much active in the industrial nations. However, there are many actors and participants, investors interested in Africa across emerging markets. And of course, the trade and investment corridors between global south essentially is very much more mature than what it used to be. So at ICBC standards, so as Jill already broke that down into ICBC, so Industrial Commercial Bank of China, one of the largest banks globally, but also in China, that is one of the big four state banks. It invested in Standard Bank in London, so we are actually a Chinese African joint entity, very much operating and interested in markets across the emerging world. And we also have a commodities business, which makes our topic of the day very interesting. So in my capacity as China economist, we talk about China's growth every day. And of course, in the current cycle, everyone's worried about when China is going to produce the quantity of growth that's necessary to propel global growth once again. Now, China in its current cycle really is not trying to reinvigorate the kind of traditional drivers of growth, very much property sector led, investment led. What it actually has been doing, and particularly very evident in the most recent 20th Party Congress, was very much building a long-term vision on how green growth, how climate change initiatives, infrastructure related to the supply chain of renewable energies in particular, not only benefits China's GDP growth in the next year or two, but longer term in its 5, 10, 15-year plan, how to build that capacity. And I think that's going to be a term that we're going to be talking about quite a lot. So whilst I don't get involved on the business, I don't advise our clients, what we do is talk about how China's macro initiatives and how China sees its new growth engines. And one of that is exactly that carbon transition. EVs is very much the most evident one in China. One of the only areas of retail sales that was very much, growing in the past few years, where zero COVID policy has been very much meaning that a lot of the activities have slowed down. EV sales have started to really, propel, and that's because China has become the EV supplier, not only in China's domestic market, which is huge, but also globally. So China is not only the consumer of carbon transition, goods and renewable energy, but also as a supplier. And I wanted to really bring back to Hannah's point about creating in Africa that green growth future, is how China can use its own, industrial capacity and help to upgrade and also to build that capacity for the supply chain of carbon transition. I think that's very much, what we need to talk about, and actually have how to leapfrog fossil fuels, supply chains, and actually find ways to really not only empower Africa to consume more renewable energy, but to help it to become an important part of the global supply chain of carbon transition goods.
Thank you, Ginny. And right at the start, I should have said that we have a sixth and secret panelist. So Kate is on the line as well. So she's moderating any questions that you may want to put in chat, so that she will jump in with those later on. So if you have questions that you want to put to the panelists, please feel free to do so. Thank you very much, Ginny. I've already thought of some questions that I have for you, but let's see if anybody else has them as well. Let's move on now to Abhishek. If you could talk a little bit about what climate investment funds are doing and your role in thinking about investment as well, that would be to kick us off there. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Sorry, my internet connection is a bit wobbly. I'm not sure.
keep going, and let's see if we can. If not, then we'll switch to Anjali and then come back to you. But have another go. Oh, it looks better. Do you want to have Abhishek? Are you?
All right. Great. Let's try again. I'm sorry, I'm in a hotel and the net is a bit wobbly, so I might drop off, but I'll do my best. I'm Abhishek Bhaskar. I work at the Climate Investment Funds, and I lead the Coal Transition Investment Program at the Climate Investment Funds. So just to begin with who we are one of the largest and oldest climate finance mechanisms. We have a funding envelope of around $11.5 billion. And we have been in operations for almost 15 years now. What we offer is risk-bearing concessional capital at scale, and concessional capital is basically capital that comes at extremely low interest rates or comes with extremely long tenors. Where we operate in 70 plus low-income and middle-income countries, and we support areas such as clean energy, forestry, resilience, and like I mentioned, the coal transition program, which was recently launched at COP26. We work exclusively with multilateral development banks. We have 6 partner MDBs. These are the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, EBRD, Inter-American Development Bank, and the World Bank Group, including IFC. So we are housed within the World Bank, but World Bank is also one of our implementing entities. The way we use our limited public finance, public capital is to deploy it in a very strategic manner to address and alleviate real and perceived risks, mobilize private sector, scale up impact, and then basically create new markets. And that's what we have been doing in the space of clean energy, in the forestry and resilience areas. And we continue to do the same, follow the same approach for coal transition, which was recently launched, and it was able to mobilize around $2.5 billion in funding from donors to be deployed in 4 countries of India, Indonesia, South Africa, and the Philippines. Now we work both through an investment in what is called a real sector in many institutions, which is to work with project developers and putting money and investing in their relevant investments, and also working through financial intermediaries, working through commercial banks, working through national banks, helping them both on the fundraising side and the fund deployment side to address these key thematic priorities. And like I said, there are a couple of gaps in our experience, and I can come in later to talk about some specific examples that we see that our funds have been able to address. One is with regard to risks. Speaker before mentioned the real and perceived risks that act as bottlenecks in Africa and in other regions as well. By demonstrating through examples, through pilots and so on, what are some of the business models, what are some of the instruments that may work, and then addressing on the softer side, more upstream side of enabling environment, where you see capacity gaps, you see gaps in policy, you see gaps in awareness, and that's where we also offer with our concessional investment finance or capital grant funding to address some of those enabling environment considerations. So let me stop here, but I'm happy to, like I said, bring in some specific examples from our portfolio and get into the details. Thanks.
Thank you, Abhishek, and I'm sure we'll be coming back for specific examples. But next we'll move on to Anjali. So Anjali Pandit, could you explain what HSBC's role is in this and what your role is as well?
Sure. So I look after the Sustainable Bonds Desk, so for EMEA and Americas. And obviously, there's different ways of receiving capital. Obviously, we work with all kinds of issuers, some who go to multinational development banks or organizations such as Climate Investment Fund. Some would go out and get equity and private equity, and others would want to raise bonds in the public market. And bonds in the public market have been an area of sustainable finance that has got a lot of attention because it's a tangible way that you can provide a reporting mechanism to the market and label that bond. So you can label that bond as a green bond, for example, and you can say that the use of proceeds are used for eligible projects for green categories. You can have sustainable bonds, you can have social bonds. We have SDG bonds, we have gender bonds, we have blue bonds. It's the kind of every color under the sun. But what it means is that there's an incredible amount of innovation happening in fixed income for issuers to be able to explain to investors how they're using CapEx to help them achieve their sustainability goals. They even have ways in which you can link KPIs to the bond, where if you don't perform against that KPI, let's say, for example, an African nation shows greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, you could pay a higher coupon if you don't achieve it. So you're actually putting in to your mention about risk, you're putting into valuation how to take ESG and value it from a risk perspective. Now, at HSBC, obviously, we're working on sustainable finance across every single product and suite. I'm talking about sustainable bonds because I run that desk, but also because it is one of the more visible areas where sustainable finance has taken off in the capital markets. I think if I just add a little bit of commentary before we start on some of the things I've heard, this concept about risk is very important because there are very divergent views as to what is bankable in terms of climate transition, right? And there are parts of the world who have really heavily focused on developing extremely robust, credible definitions of what should be considered green, right? So for example, we're at the EU side event. The European Union is a place in the world that has really robust, high quality, highly kind of thought through regulation around the definition of what is green. However, one of the things that we grapple with as a bank, as an intermediary, is when we're trying to translate those definitions, whether that be in Africa, whether that be in Latin America, whether that be in Asia Pacific, whether that be in the Middle East, they don't always translate to what is the required capital to help that region transition. Right. So I don't want to use the word label green. It's not what's green there, because there's some people who believe what's green is only green and everything else is brownish. But I mean, there's sort of different important focuses that need to happen in every part, every country, every region of that country, every sector. And that's something I think we all need to work on globally, is that we need more understanding of the local aspects of what is needed for the transition in order for us to be able to move capital into the right places.
So I think just unpacking that last point, because I think all of you have touched on that to a certain extent, I think it's worth, are there examples or illustrations of that you could give to really help us grapple with the problems that we're facing? I'm very interested in what the obstacles are to investment, and I think you've raised the perceived risks as opposed to the real risks, and how those have shifted over the last, certainly as far as I was involved in Africarbon about 14 years ago, and I think things have moved on a lot since then. So thinking about how to apply what is green as defined by Europe, and how that doesn't translate into one of the countries that we might want to see this investment in. I would really like each of you to kind of think about that and give us an example of how that comes up in your work, really. So, Anjali, can I ask you to start off on that?
Yeah, so for again, because the sort of green bond market is so tangible, it's like a common problem that we grapple with, is the European regulation has come out with something called the EU taxonomy, which is basically a massive list of what should be considered as a green eligible project. And within that, there's a section called technical screening criteria that provides you very technical thresholds and eligibility criteria of what would be labeled green. So for example, if we take clean transportation, there would be a kind of amount of grams of CO2 per kilometer that would have to be applied, which, and if I take maybe the EV example you brought up, very simply would basically only mean that like pure electric vehicles, in some cases also countries where the sort of electricity grid is heavily fed by coal, that could also be challenging to meet that threshold. It's challenging because in some areas of the world, sort of hybrids or even plug-in hybrids would be extremely important in the region because there's less electrical infrastructure, charging infrastructure. So those types of activities, none of them would be eligible unless they technically met this very distinct threshold, which is, quite frankly, much easier to meet in the European Union.
Which is what it's designed for.
Exactly,
really.
exactly. And I guess, although it's becoming a global phenomenon, and there's different pockets of the world, Japanese investors, Brazilian investors, etc., that have really adopted ESG investing as an ethos, a lot of the broader benchmarks, standards, discourse, the thought leadership has come out of the EU. So even though the EU taxonomy, very clearly is labeled EU, there is a very large section of European investor base that sort of wishes and hopes to apply it globally.
Which is a kind of a good thing, but it's not dealing with the obstacles that might actually exist on the ground, I think is what you're saying.
I think we just need it to be a practical approach.
And building on that, there's actually now the EU-China. So there's an EU-China taxonomy built on common principles, common grounds. I think the point about this is not expecting the whole world to abide by the same standards. Standards are important. What it does is help transparency, is to really set a basic foundation. And it's important for EU, China, and hopefully the US as well, because essentially, while we're sitting here talking about this, capital markets, the largest capital markets and the biggest bond markets out there, US, China, now the second largest bond market in the world, and of course, European Union. If the largest capital markets and bond market could at least set that standard, obviously participants who wish to be part of that large bond market will have to somehow abide that. However, participants in that bond market is really important. So what you'll find is a lot of the high quality issuers are able to access that market very easily, but others can't. And coming back to this perceived risk is, who are the issuers? There's lots of buyers out there, of course, we know. Also, not only private investors, but definitely some of the largest asset managers who themselves may also represent, for example, sovereign funds. They're searching for really high quality assets. But the issuers, I don't know whether you agree, there's really only a few issuers, I think, out there who are able to tap that market successfully, and really for the reasons that we really want them to, a really transparent way. Just one last point. China domestically also, there are initiatives to not only tap on the green bond market, and I think there's a lot of focus on that, but in China, and particularly emerging markets who are dependent on bank loans still, not really just a fixed income market. What China's been doing, particularly helped by the central bank, is to provide green credit. So essentially accessing lower costs of funding. We talked a little bit about how Africa, because of the country risk or perceived risk, sovereign ratings, etc., cost of funding is very high. And obviously, given the current rate environment with Fed still hiking, global rates are high, inflation is high. China has a luxury at the moment where it's been able to really defend inflation. So inflation is below 3%. Cost of funding is really historically low. So tapping that low cost of funding, not only domestically in China, but essentially helping the rest of the emerging world to access that low cost of capital, in my view, is essential.
And one of the things, it seems, is we have the aspirational taxonomy of what should be applied in developed countries, and it's how we then ensure that we get the right investments that at least is moving towards that in developing countries. Abhishek, can you draw on your experience on what are the obstacles that are faced and how we might overcome them?
Sure, and I'll just start by saying that I agree with much of what has been said. I used to work at the Treasury at IFC and was involved in one of the first bond issuances or green bond issuances like almost 8-9 years ago. So I hear from everyone loud and clear. But I'll bring in some perspective from the fund deployment side, on the downstream investment side. And let me use an example of India, where we have a major program. So one of the key business features of ours is that we provide capital at scale. So not literally in a project by project basis, but rather in terms of a funding envelope, which a country presents in the form of an investment plan. So for example, India has an investment plan of close to $850 million through us to support some of these activities, primarily focused on solar. So let me touch upon that. In around 2015, the government set a very ambitious renewable energy target. Of that, almost 100 gigawatt was earmarked for solar. And because it was a new sector, there was a lot of perception risk of what would work, what would not. There was a lack of clarity and awareness around the business models that would work, what would be the commercial viability of such investments, et cetera, et cetera. This is 2015 or so. We went in and we worked with the World Bank to put together a credit line with the largest national bank in the country, the State Bank of India, for around $625 million. And it was coupled with a small tranche of grant financing to support some of the enabling environment, technical assistance kind of activities upstream. What that did was the 625 million from 2015, when the capacity of rooftop solar was around 500 megawatt, over the next, I would say, six and a half years, it opened up the market by demonstrating what would work, what may not work through these credit lines that the State Bank of India supported using our concessional money. So first of all, what our concessional funds did was that it lowered the cost of financing roughly around 1.5 to 2%, which made a huge impact early on. You are looking at early investors getting into a market. Then it helped mobilize the private sector and facilitated their participation in the market, open up the market, and then scaled up. So the 500 megawatt capacity in 2015 is now around end of last year was around 7.5 gigawatt of rooftop solar. The 625 million in concessional funds that we have deployed is now grown into a market of roughly $5 billion, or almost 8 times the mobilization of the core financing. Now, how did we do and what were some of the impacts? I talked about the numbers, but I talked about the reduction in costs. There were also, on the softer side, things like capacity building that we did with local discoms, local actors, the financial intermediaries, the banks, to build their capacity to look at, evaluate, and understand what project requirements are to support rooftop solar projects. We ran awareness campaigns at local, state, and federal level to, again, help grow the awareness about the technology, about the models, about the financing, just so as to support the utilities and the private sector to take up more of these activities. What some of this also did was we trained almost 2,000 plus people around it for the uptake. And some of this work also helped create an aggregation model that could then be used to securitize. And again, tying it back to the bond issuance discussion, that we were able to then come up with a modality that would help mobilize funding and grow it even more. So now it is looking at more riskier sectors like MSMEs and others in the country, which it was not initially. So you can see the growth and the evolution of the sector from 2015 or so, when there was a hesitation to look at and manage or understand these risks, to now where they are deliberately looking at MSME sector to support, which is the riskier sector, to support and grow this market. So this is one such example. There are others in Turkey on energy efficiency, where we helped create a market that did not exist. And that was only possible through a very strategic deployment of public resources, which are extremely limited, but they are very, very impactful in the sense, in the nature of them, in the nature of how it is deployed, depending on the sector and technology. Thanks.
Hannah, you talked right at the start about the perceptions of what Africa, for example, is doing and is capable of, versus the reality. I think, having listened to what the other panelists have said, there is a huge gap between expectations and reality, and actually the reality is probably further forward than many people assume. What are the things that need to happen, do you think, to really unlock the potential of developing countries, particularly in Africa? This is an Africa COP this year, but elsewhere in the world, what are the things that we have learned over the last 10 years about what we have done well and what we have done, frankly, not so well, and should avoid in the future?
Big question.
Yeah.
And then I didn't expect to be in this panel, but yeah, thank you for bringing me in. Because obviously, listening to what other panelists have said, of course, it's one, insightful, and two, of course, I also have my own questions and kind of reflections on it.
And please do feel free to ask each other questions.
I mean, well, so kind of building on the kind of examples aspects and again this kind of question about risk and where do we go, what have we learned? And I think we're learning that we can do more, definitely. One, there are lots of examples of bonds. There are examples where even Chinese investors have been able to go out and do more and are going into the clean energy and clean finance or green finance sectors. That is happening, right? Although at a smaller scale than we might hope for, and there's more that can be done. But I think we have to also still take the big picture, and I think, for example, coming back to the question on the kind of bond standards, for instance, and I think it kind of almost goes to the heart of this issue around just transition that many African countries are talking about. And let me pick on Abhishek's example. If you're talking about deployment of solar on households, for instance, in African countries, now that would be a great project, except that you would need to label that as green, even if you're also building the houses, basically. Whereas in Europe, it's deployment of just the solar panels. In India, it's probably more deployment of the solar panels rather than building the houses from scratch. But in Nairobi, you're building houses as well. So how do we make sure that the standards accommodate that aspect, that you've still got to continue growing, you've got to create.
Do we need?
You need subways, you need rail, etc., and all of these things.
Do we need a sort of taxonomy for each country? Do you think, based on where they are? I mean, that's quite a big bit of work.
I don't know.
Well, I'm a bit. So why do we have taxonomies? Right? I mean, everyone has a different view, but one of the reasons for having taxonomies is because there's sort of a desire to define something which is undefinable.
Avoid greenwash is what I wanted to say.
Well, because the reason people would say that they want a definition is so that they can feel safe within it. Now, of course, that's also to navigate greenwashing, but the reality is sustainability is extremely complex. That's why there's 17 sustainable development goals, because it's extremely complex. And actually, for example, investing in a housing infrastructure which isn't LEED, platinum, APC-A, but actually brings decent housing in a decent commuting area of Nairobi is one of the most impactful things you can do there. It would never be allowed technically to be labeled green or social, even no matter what it was delivering. And because I think that's where we need to challenge ourselves. Listen, I come from the market where we want to label things and give that transparency, but I would also challenge us back to say, do we need those labels? Because at some point we have to provide ESG data and disclosure, and investors have to have that information.
So I need to push back on that, because obviously the reason for taxonomy is because there's been so much rubbish labelled as green, and there probably still is. And there's also a problem where, being incredibly old and having worked in this area for a long time, that there have been missteps along the way. So there were things that we thought were good turned out not to be such a good idea. And I can give you a couple of examples up front. One was obviously the early biofuels, which were actually more carbon intensive than the fossil fuels they were replacing, and that was a well-intentioned misstep. And then obviously, the directives in Europe on diesel, which were seen as lower carbon, but created dreadful air quality problems. So recognizing that there are missteps along the way, and frankly, there are a lot of sharks out there who would like to label things as green when they're not. What is the solution here? Because if we don't have any labels or standards, how do we know that what we're doing is at least pointing in the right direction?
But we will keep
missteps.
I think it's going to be hard not to have missteps. I think it's going to be hard. At some point, we need to innovate and try every single technology. And then we need to be able to make quick decisions that actually is not working.
In my view, I think, it's about creating incentives, but also obviously for the greenest or the priority projects, I would call it, because it's, in Africa, you probably need, or any of the developing nations who are most vulnerable to climate emergencies, so the flooding, making buildings more resilient, not just by rebuilding it, like what we do in the West, rebuilding roads that are from the Industrial Revolution, etc., but actually from the very beginning, when you're building a house, making it completely, resilient resilient to climate change. I mean, that is part of the priority I think emerging markets need right now. And of course, the multilateral development funds, like the ones that Abhishek talked about, they have been absolutely, forefront of that, because their aim is really more about the SDGs rather than just ESG investing or etc. or renewables in itself. So I think emerging markets are in a very different stage. So rather than saying we all need the same thing, let's ask ourselves, what do individual countries actually need? What are the priorities? And then try to mobilize the resources and capitals.
That does speak to maybe a taxonomy for each country, or a roadmap for each country.
I think roadmap is a bit of a
maybe that makes targets.
Yeah.
Because so I think one of the issues, for example, is I was speaking about renewable production and how that is very much concentrated in the rest of the world, not in the African continent. Maybe if you had some kind of target for renewable finance or renewable delivery, production, deployment, etc., and you said, well, we're going to be kind of creating a taxonomy that is helping us to get to that target, and therefore that's what your taxonomy is about. Because otherwise, what could easily happen is that your taxonomy ends up pushing investment towards the same old areas rather than new ones.
Yeah.
So it is a really delicate balancing act. And when you say, well, maybe these things are just not.
So taking it back to the question that has, Abhishek, sorry, we're so deeply involved here in the room. So please come in.
Not at all. I'm missing being in that room. So I just wanted to reflect on a couple of things. One is, I think missteps is experience, and that is important. Anything that we try will lead to, I won't call it missteps, but rather experience. I started my career looking at CDM way back in 2004. Within my first phase of my career, I saw the prices plummet from $20 a ton of CO2 to 20 cents. And I went through that cycle, but I still think, looking back after 15 years of hindsight, that it was important, because now we know how to talk about additionality. Now we know how to consider baselines, how we calculate or estimate or have a principle around estimating emission reduction. I think it throws a lot of experience, which may not be direct, and the continuation of a program or an idea does not necessarily mean that it has succeeded, or vice versa, that lack of continuation does not necessarily mean that it has failed. So I would consider that aspect of misstep or experience. To the question around the role of nomenclature or a taxonomy, we were also involved in you may have heard of the JET partnership that was announced at last COP for South Africa. And we at the Climate Investment Funds were asked to convene the secretariat. We helped put together the investment plan that was released last week, endorsed by the cabinet a couple of weeks earlier. One of the questions we faced as we were looking to mobilize funds for South Africa, it's like $1 trillion R&D need, for South African just energy transition ambition, was exactly to answer the question of how do we direct finance for those who are interested in participating? How do we tell them that this is green, this is just and not? One area is green taxonomy. Another area that's coming, I think, in my mind is coming up is around the just transition taxonomy. If everything in an area like Mpumalanga in South Africa is considered to be important to facilitate just transition, is all of it just? Or is it going to result in diverting funds away from ODA resources? So these are important questions. And I think having a taxonomy, having a definition provides those guardrails within which investors who may not entirely be familiar, or in fact, even those who may be familiar with some of these ideas, are able to direct their funds to. And the transparency helps, because then they can take it back to their shareholders and say, this is what we invested in. You can see it. You may not agree with it, but you have it. It's not a fungible, box of everything goes in. So just 2 cents from my side on those two aspects.
And a very useful 2 cents in my view. So I do think, my personal view is that there is a need for guidance. Investors don't know what to invest in. And as we make missteps along the way, they do risk having stranded assets. And it seems fair to give them as much guidance as we can, with that caveat that sometimes there are unintended consequences to our decisions, so that we think we're going down a path that is good, and then it turns out to have some consequences that we hadn't considered. I do think it would be quite interesting to hear from you how we, given these difficulties, what might be a path forward to allow investors sufficient confidence in investing in the places that we know have huge potential that is unrealized, and for many of them not a transition but a kind of energy access. I think for a lot of Africa it's not going to be a transition from one source of energy to another, but to access to the basics of life that we take for granted in the Western world. So I'd be really interested to hear from you. What are the things that you, from sitting where you are in your current role, you would like to see to help get that investment to the places that we need it to be? Followed by how you'd solve world peace, obviously.
And hunger. No, I think, actually, I want to go back to what you said earlier about roadmaps, because I still am a bit nervous that every country trying to create their own taxonomy would be quite a cumbersome exercise, right? Yes. But actually, a roadmap for the country. So, and sorry to bring it back to bonds, but I think a lot of times I've found that when a sovereign does a green bond, they explain their country's transition strategy in a new, not in a political way, not at a COP event, but actually to their investor base. And, those investors, some of them buy bonds, some of them buy project finance, some of them buy, all kinds of interesting alternative products. So that investor gets up to date with that sovereign's entire strategy and what they see their future energy mix to look like. And they understand what role could carbon capture storage play, what role is energy efficiency, talking about the just transition. We want to make sure there's still capital going towards reducing the emissions of the fossil fuel sector as well, because almost every nation is going to be dependent on it for at least a few more decades, right? And what role and what stimulus is required for renewable energy and alternative technologies. So I think that roadmap, I found very often that when you have a country do that exercise, it suddenly encourages so much more private sector and SSA kind of smaller sub-sovereign areas of that country to go out and bring that data to the market and say, look, this is what I'm going to do. I'm raising the capital for this, and look, it fits into my country's bigger strategy.
I'm going to put you on the spot and say, have you got examples that we could go away and look at? Because I think, it would be.
So Canada did a green bond. We did it. We structured it. They came out in February. And I think I like the Canada one about 6 months before the UK had done it, right? And I think the Canada one and the UK one are interesting because instead of just looking around the country and finding the green projects that they had and putting it under a framework, which a little bit more was the trend before, they actually told their entire transition story. So they brought CCUS into the framework, the UK government, for the first time that we saw. Canada put large hydro, which was a very complex conversation, right? Because large hydro doesn't always fit into green eligibility criteria. But they said, whether or not you're completely comfortable with that, we know that large hydro is going to be one of the main drivers of our emissions reduction strategy,
Unless they have drought.
Yeah.
Unless they have drought caused by climate change.
There's going to be so many things that are going to waver everyone's transition strategy. But I think it's just an interesting way in which what we've seen after that are a lot more investors in those two countries getting up to speed with what is good climate investing, what is needed in their country, as well as issuers, a bunch of issuers coming with new types of innovations and technologies linked to the country strategy.
Well, I think we'd all like to be Canada, obviously, but obviously, particularly for the emerging economies that face a whole host of other domestic priorities, it always obviously is not that easy. And of course, it's great to have these kind of what good looks like, but really to scale it up, we need to make it even easier, particularly for the ones that are facing that climate emergency. So I do realize that, of course, governments play a crucial role in this, and they do need to lead the market. That's absolutely true. And I do believe sovereigns play a really crucial role to mobilize that resource. But I think it still has to be more than that. It's a public-private partnership. I know we talk about that a lot in every sort of infrastructure level. Everywhere you go to, you would talk about these PPP. And then we talk about the governance. But these projects are multi-year projects, you know, a lot of these. So no one single entity can come and guarantee that. So I think we should have sovereigns as leaders, because obviously they should be the most transparent when it comes to roadmaps, ambitions, targets for climate transition, but other participants need to come in, whether it's the largest financial institutions, whether it's sovereign funds, whether it's private equity investors. The channel for mobilizing different parts of those resources to come in at different levels of risk appetite, I think is really important. So having that very high level issuance, sovereign, great, but different investors need to come at different appetite of risk. And I think that's where the financial institutions need to do a lot of work to help, particularly in the high risk countries that we would internally classify with higher risk scores, to help them to essentially access the financing that they very much need more than anyone else, frankly.
Yeah. Abhishek, let's have your 2 cents on this as well, please.
Thanks. I think the key prerequisites for driving investments, I would boil it down to one word, which is intent. And how do you demonstrate intent? There, I think, from my experience, I can sum it up in 3 different ways. Starting with setting up ambition. A country should show intent by setting up an ambition, which is something that South Africa did. I'm just using it for an example, as an example for the context of Africa. But what South Africa did by setting out that this is what we are committing to, what many other countries are doing through their revised NDCs now, that we are attempting a net zero by 2050, 2060, 2045, or what you may, what Indonesia is looking to commit to, and some of the other countries like India and so on. The second I would put it in the policy bucket, which is once you have established ambition, what are some of the policies that you have set out or are planning to set out to get on that ambitious pathway? That again will show intent that you're matching your ambition setting through real action to drive investments. And finally, I would say translating all of that into a strategic prioritization exercise, which is very importantly must be country-led and country-owned. So a country should lead and own the process of setting out what are its key strategic priorities in a sector, be it energy transition, be it just transition, be it any other. But it should be the outcome of a country-led process, which is consultative, involving all key stakeholder groups, and to come up with that in a more systematic manner, which is, again, using South Africa as an example, what it did through the JET investment plan that was released last week. And then once you have that, then I think there are investors around, all kinds of investors, large pots of money around, who can come in, who can try to be part of a calculus to deliver on those strategic priorities in a way that reflects the local country considerations and so on, reflects the use of institutional investors versus public finance versus private and so on. All those things can be figured out. But I think once we have those 3 key ingredients, then we will have the opportunity for investors to come in and support scaling up of activities. Thanks.
I'm going to throw in one big example this year of where a country needs both transition finance, development finance, but also Pakistan this year, where I think 2 million homes were washed away, 35 million people were displaced. It needs everything. How do you get investment and the right sort of investment into a country like Pakistan to enable it to be resilient to future effects of climate change, and at the same time build its development and its future prosperity? Are there things that we should be thinking about now? That there surely are things that we should be thinking about now to address what I suspect is going to be, on an almost annual basis, there will be some countries somewhere in the world that is experiencing these impacts.
Catastrophes.
Yeah, absolute catastrophes.
I'll make it so sorry, no, maybe Abhishek, I think.
Okay,
it's more of a development.
Okay, Abhishek, I think you start us off on this. What is a very unfair question, I appreciate, but it is one that I think we're going to have to deal with.
Absolutely. And see, one of the areas I focus on is also, like I mentioned, an enabling environment grant facility. And we had a dedicated green and resilient recovery line of funding that we had after, of course, the COVID outbreak in 2020, 21. And that taught us a number of lessons. One is it could be Pakistan today, Ukraine yesterday, and COVID a day before, and it will continue. I think the trend of some kind of instability is not going to be is not unique, and it's going to continue. It's not going to be uncommon moving forward. I think the approach should be to immediately the focus should be on relief, of course, to make sure that people who are affected are taken care of, and the right funding and processes are in place to take care of them and their needs. But more important, not more important, I would say the next important thing would then be to focus on a recovery, which is green, which is resilient, and then direct funding in a similar fashion as to meet those goals that the country sets. So I think relief followed by recovery is a modality I would approach in the case of Pakistan or in any other country that faces the next round of instability.
We have just a few minutes left, and we have a fire drill here at the top of the hour. So we will be finishing on time, but I'm going to ask very quickly, Ginny, Anjali, for your thoughts, and then hand over to Hannah for any final thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, just on that example of Pakistan, and of course, any other subsequent countries that will face that emergency, that's the priority. And I think this is what, how this should be brought into reality, and that we are already facing a climate emergency, not actually closer to home, because here in London even we see that, but the priorities are those who are losing livelihoods, who haven't even had the time to build their urbanization, and they're still having to live with the consequences that much of the industrial world has done. So China and Pakistan have had a very close relationship, particularly the Belt and Road Initiative. But my fear is that a lot of these particularly government-to-government type of initiatives, and we talked about long-termism, but usually these are heavily scrutinized. Obviously, the lack of transparency, level of corruption involved, etc. And that's right. I think investors should be scrutinizing that. But I think when it comes to climate emergency, we do need to have international institutions coming in to obviously verify that, and that's very important. But crucially, climate transition needs to be depoliticized. Which countries are involved shouldn't matter. We think we just need to mobilize those capital to the most, priority needs.
I'll just put one thing. All of us, especially the investor community, we need to think about what does transition mean for us. Does it mean we want to hold green assets and we only want to fund green assets, or does it mean that we want our portfolio to reflect what the world needs to transition? And in order to do that, we need to rethink risk, right? And that's what's a bit missing. So if you look at African countries and you talk to a European investor, they would have a list of African countries they can't invest in, but actually they'll turn around and talk about how much they want to impact the SDGs and climate. If you really want to impact the SDGs and climate, then you got to be investing in those countries.
Absolutely. Thank you, Hannah.
I think Angeline took the words out of my mouth, really. I fully agree. We need to rethink that. And I think communication is really key to that. So helping investors really understand what is actually happening, what needs to be done, and not leaving it just to the countries to do what they do. Because countries are ambitious, they're trying, they've got all the roadmaps, they've got so many different plans, etc. They really are, especially African countries, have done so much. That the challenge is persuading and pushing investors to rethink differently and to see these as great opportunities. And I think we can do that.
Thank you. And thank you very much to my panelists for a really interesting and lively discussion this morning. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yes.